Hello and welcome to the Debating Toastcast, a podcast about all things debating, from the Debate Toastmasters Club 104 London Debaters. Hi, and welcome to the Debating Toastcast with your host, me, William Hagerup. I'm one of the debate coaches at 104 London Debaters, which is a Toastmasters debating club in London. Now, this is the second episode in a series of fairly short podcast episodes on the topic of rhetoric. The content is based on a workshop we did in the club called Rhetoric, the Building Blocks of Persuasion. And in this, the second in the series, we are going to talk about enthymemes. You've heard about memes? Now you're going to hear about enthymemes. Enthymeme is another Greek term, and together with logos, ethos, and pathos, it's one that I think is useful to learn and remember. It's a concept that Aristotle also developed, and it describes something that we actually do all the time without thinking. The term literally means inside the head, but the definition in the context of debating is an argument with an unstated premise. Now, this is something, as I mentioned, we do all the time. When you say, for example, I'm hungry, let's get a burger. The unstated premise there is that the burger will indeed satiate your hunger. Now, this may seem obvious, but the point is that it only works if the unstated premise is something that your listeners indeed do agree with you is true. So take, for example, the classic syllogism. Premise A, Socrates is a man. Okay, yes, we all agree with that. Premise B, all men are mortal. Well, yes, so it would seem. And therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Well, look, in a normal conversation, even in a debate, we could just take away the second premise there that all men are mortal, because everybody knows that. And we can safely assume that our audience would know that and agree that that's the case. And as a matter of fact, unless Socrates happened to be, the name of your boat or some other inanimate object, we could even take away premise A, the first one, that Socrates is a man. We assume that he is a man. We could just go straight to the conclusion. Socrates is mortal. Yeah, because you know what? He's a human being and they are mortal. And we all know that. We don't actually need to spell that out. And that is an enthymeme. But if we take a more controversial issue and say, premise A, smoking is bad for people's health. Premise B, it is the state's responsibility to ensure people make healthy choices, and therefore conclusion, the state should ban smoking. Well, here we can safely assume that most people will probably agree with premise A, that smoking is indeed bad for you. But hey, premise B there is much more controversial. Many people would not agree that the state should be some sort of nanny state and make people take healthy choices. So if you, for example, were to argue something like this, smoking is bad for people's health, and therefore the state should ban smoking, which incidentally is more or less what Rishi Sunak did, the British Prime Minister at time of recording, at the Conservative Party conference in the summer of 2023. Well, then you are leaving out something about which there is considerable disagreement. And so that's not a very good enthymeme, actually. Now, to see how this may look in a well-argued case, so this is an example of how it's used really, really well. Let's look at an article by Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, the former Supreme Court judge, and this was recently published in the Spectator magazine. And in this article, he argues for Britain's withdrawal from the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, and I quote, "One point should be made at the outset and never overlooked. We do not need the European Convention on Human Rights in order to protect human rights. Many of the rights which the Convention proclaims were part of British law long before the Convention was conceived. There is nothing in it that we cannot enact by ordinary domestic legislation. We can have whatever rights we want if there is sufficient democratic mandate for them. The real purpose of the Convention is to make us accept rights which we do not want and for which there may be no democratic mandate." Now, there are several unstated premises in the article, and in this particular extract, the two most important are, firstly, having codified human rights is a good thing. This is a premise that he doesn't state that explicitly, but it's certainly there as a foundation for what he says. Okay, and then secondly is that there must be a democratic mandate for them in this country. Again, he doesn't explicitly say that there must be a democratic mandate. And the reason why he doesn't spell these two premises out is that he is assuming that the people that he needs to convince, his audience, that they do agree with him on these premises. That human rights are something that should be codified. It's a good thing that they are codified, that they are written down in law. But also that his audience understands that such things should have a democratic mandate, that that's also necessary and a good thing. And therefore, he doesn't need to spend time on spelling out why a democratic mandate is necessary or why codified human rights is a good thing. He just takes that for granted that everybody who he needs to convince will agree with him on these points. And thus, he saves time, or in this case, of course, column space, for what his audience actually needs to hear. Namely that the court is not working according to its original purpose. Now, for us at 104 London Debaters and in many other formal debate contexts, a key function of the enthymeme is actually that we can save time when we are presenting an argument for some motion or other. Remember, we only have 7 minutes for the main speeches in our debates, and the first speech also has to give the definitions. The other speakers also have to respond and rebut. So there is really very little time to give the premises that you really need to give. And as such, it's very useful to focus only on that which you really need to say, what you need to prove, what you need to back up, what the audience needs to hear in order to vote for your side. So let's try this with an example. So let me give here stated premises. According to the Office of National... Now, let me first say, I'm just making this up, okay? There's no factuality here. As far as I know, there may be, but I have just made this up as an example. So, according to the Office of National Statistics, people are eating less fruit than the recommended amount. This is premise 1. Premise 2. This has an adverse health effect, long term. Okay? And then premise 3. Habits are formed in youth. Conclusion, therefore, which might be the motion of the debate, the government should ensure free fruit in all primary and secondary schools so that children get into the habit of eating fruit. Okay, now in this argument, where the motion is that the government should provide free fruit, there are 3 stated premises. So this is what I set out right in the debate. However, some of these premises, and indeed the conclusion itself, also have some unstated premises behind them, such as, for premise number 1, the enthymeme here is that we should eat more fruit. I don't say that, I don't spell that out. You know, it's people eat less fruit. Okay, so what? But if we all agree we should eat more fruit, then that becomes a problem that needs to be solved. In premise 2, the enthymeme is that adverse health effects are something that both can and indeed should be done something to avoid. Again, why mention it if not, right? If you can't do anything about it, or if you don't think it's desirable to do anything about it, then why even mention the adverse health effects that arise from it? Now, premise 3 hasn't really got a hidden premise as such, other than you assume people agree with it. This was the one that habits are formed in youth, right? Now, you may need to give some backing for it, some studies or something, but the important thing with the third premise here is that it is the warrant, as we call it, or the link that links premises 1 and 2 with the conclusion that the government ought to ensure that good fruit habits are established at a young age. Because if habits are not formed at a young age, well, then there's no point giving them fruit at a young age, right? So that's the link. Now, the conclusion itself has another unstated premise, and that is, of course, that it is the government's responsibility to do something about people's consumption of fruit. As a debater, you need to make a judgment on which of these premises you need to spend time spelling out the backing for. Just like with the smoking argument, is it the job of government to do this? And the more controversial, the more doubtful the premise is, the more time you need to spend on it, because you need to convince people that the premise is true, relevant, and important enough. And that depends a lot on your audience, of course. Now, the details of that is for another workshop on the Logos, how to put together a strong case. The point here is that you need to be aware of what are the unstated premises so that you can make a choice, whether to spell them out or whether to save time by leaving them unstated, and also which ones you should leave unstated, which ones you can leave unstated. That saves you time in the debate. But another important function of being aware of the enthymeme is that you can call out the other side when they use one that there isn't general agreement on. So again, back to what Rishi Sunak did at the conference, just assuming that everybody thinks it's the state's role to sort of force us to make healthy choices. And incidentally, that gradual smoking ban by age group is a policy that was tried in New Zealand, but the new government there is now dropping it, apparently. So that's an interesting one for a debate, perhaps. And with the previous example on the fruit issue, whether to give fruits to children, the opposition there could definitely make the point that, the proposition seemed to assume that it was for the government rather than parents and individuals to make the choice, to make choices generally on fruit consumption. So the main point is, bring out any unstated premise of which there can be any controversy or any disagreement, bring it out into the open, and then make the other side spend time defending this premise that they try to sort of slip in unnoticed. And then they will have less time rebutting your points and also less time making their own arguments. So that's a win-lose situation. You win, they lose. Well, hopefully. So in conclusion, an enthymeme is an argument with one or more unstated premises, a concept that Aristotle came up with. We do it all the time in everyday situations, but in debates, you need to be careful that any unstated premises are in fact agreed upon by the audience, that they agree with you that is true. Otherwise, you risk not being very persuasive and that the other side points it out. But used carefully and intelligently, the enthymeme can save you time by enabling you to focus on those premises that really need backing up. But how do you know which premises the audience are likely to accept without any sort of further backing up? Well, that depends a lot on your audience. And in the next episode, we are going to talk about just that, the audience. You've heard the advice, know your audience. Worst advice ever given. Try and forget it. Why? Listen to the next episode, episode 3 in the series Rhetoric, the building blocks of persuasion, to find out.
You've been listening to the Debating Toastcast. Feel free to leave a comment, critical or encouraging. We welcome both. And if you'd like more information about joining the club or coming first as a guest, please have a look at our website, 104londondebaters.club, or send us an email on info@104londondebaters.club. That's info@104londondebaters.club. Thank you for listening.